This is the Journey NYC podcast. This is episode 15. My name is Anthony Luke-Akagi. I'm your host today. I am missing my friend and one of our co-founders, Jesse Dufresne, who is in the Colorado Rockies somewhere doing his thing. I miss him tremendously, and I'm waiting for him to...
probably like dehydrating meat and going camping and stuff.
Well, that's what he did. And then the thing is, he also ended up in a hammock somewhere in the middle of the night. He's kind of the outdoorsy person right now.
Yeah.
But we had this
for his dog too.
Exactly. I was like, that is the best case scenario of perfect parenting. The dog is spoiled.
Yes.
Anyway, guys, today our guest is actually Bandhu. Pun is actually a highly successful Asian actor. We are very late on our discussion around Asian visibility, and all of that was happening in May and June. I know that we had talked to Pun a while ago about doing the podcast, and we had actually wanted to chat with him, because
make it sound like being Asian is a disability or something.
In some respects, it feels that way at times. Pun and I have had long conversations about this, so we're just going to dive in. Pun, why don't you tell us a little bit about you first?
Okay. Well, I think success is relative. I'm not going to describe myself as a successful Asian American actor because, when you're on the inside, it's never enough.
Sure.
But I am an Asian actor, also a producer.
Cool.
And I grew up in Indonesia. And I went to an international school there in Jakarta, which is where I first got where the lightning bolt of inspiration struck.
Where it hit you.
Yeah. Actually, it was really cool. I was watching a documentary. Jakarta International School is actually celebrating its 70th anniversary this summer. And there was a documentary made when the school turned 50 about the start of the school. And I had never seen it before, but I didn't really realize how lucky I was to have been the beneficiary of basically this school system that started out that was all teacher led. And there was such freedom given to these teachers because they're like no international school like this had existed before.
Sure.
But with expatriates coming in after Indonesia gained independence, there was a real need for these expats to send their children someplace, and these were teachers from who were reared in the British system and the American system and systems from all over the world. Actually, there were a lot of teachers there from India as well, and but anyways, they were given such freedom to literally create the ideal school environment. And even down to like the modules, the architecture that they discussed, everything was like outside. And so that you would like go from class to class with like, you would have these like moments of focus and then a break that would like diffuse it all. And you'd be outside in sort of like beautiful greenery, and sort of the inculcation of the arts into every single aspect of the curriculum. And I was really fortunate that the teacher of the chorus, the choir, the high school choir, it was kindergarten to high school, was actually the mom of my best friend.
Oh.
I was 4 years old at the time, but he took me to go see his mom's production of West Side Story. That the high schoolers were doing, and I just remember that production still is so like indelible in my mind. It's like etched. It's sort of like just these students that were pushed to their limits of to their greatness, to their potential.
Absolutely.
Like these productions were amazing. Like all of Jakarta would come see them, and they would like bring them. Like the students would actually participate in choir competitions with other international schools across Asia. And actually there's an interesting side story in the documentary where they were actually asked by the CIA to to infiltrate like certain other Asian countries. Like that was their cover.
Oh my
Was
God.
it was as a high school choir coming
Choir.
into, yeah, exactly,
The
to check
Glee
out.
Club was cool. And
Yeah,
it was very stealth.
exactly. Like Glee Club was cooler than James Bond. Like how could you not want to be an actor in that environment?
Exactly.
So,
So you started
that's
in Indonesia.
yeah.
And then how did you get here to New York?
My dad was transferred to a job in New York, and so he moved
Okay.
the whole family to New Jersey, which was a real culture shock for me of sorts.
How old were you when that happened?
I was 13.
Okay.
I was 13. And for the first 6 months when we landed, I went to school in Forest Hills, Queens. And
Whoa.
that was the first time that I had experienced, walking into the school lunchroom, and all the Asians were sitting on one table, and all the Black kids were sitting at another table, and all the white kids were at another table. And that was, to me, sort of like the biggest cultural shock about America was, coming from an international school environment where your aspect of difference was what made you special, and people celebrated it, and coming to an environment that was so divided and segregated was really a trip. And it was the first time I ever got beat up too, for no reason whatsoever, just like walking across the basketball court being chased.
Yeah.
And then I remember I was actually walking with a Latino kid who was he and I lived in the same building, and his father was actually the super of the building. So we would take the bus to school and home from school. So he was my buddy, and we got beat up together. And then we went, it was kind of like we went to the bus stop, and just sort of didn't get a chance to really process things, went home, and then like 15 minutes later, his dad comes to our door. My mom answers, and he's like, is Pun available? And my mom's like, yeah, sure, thinking that he was asking me to go
Sure.
Pun or something. But then we crawled into his car and we drove back to the school neighborhood, and he had a gun across his lap as he was pointing to like different groups of boys, and he was like, is that them? And I was like, holy shit, welcome to America, dude.
It's so interesting to hear that coming from you immigrating from Indonesia to the States, because I grew up, as we've spoken about before, in Hawaii, where I was the majority. And then when I finally moved to New York, I still didn't feel all that much like a minority, although I will say that I definitely did not have the same sort of majority feel that it does in Hawaii, where you are of a mixed Asian ethnicity. I did not understand what it felt like to feel like a minority until I actually started working in theater abroad, like in Germany. That's when I really understood what it felt like. And then I began thinking, wow, I've never felt like this before. So, and I was already in my 20s. To think about you having to feel like that at 13 is kind of mind-blowing.
But at the same time, like you say, it's how most Asian kids grow up all the time in America, right? I mean,
exactly.
Most of them don't have the ability to have ever experienced what it feels like to be in a majority country, to be a majority in the country.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really good point, Ant, because I think that sort of, look, if this is a podcast about the journey you take, I think so much of these, overcoming obstacles has so much to do with the obstacles that we mentally place upon ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think you and I have the benefit of not necessarily having grown up thinking of ourselves as lesser than. And it's really so subtle. But I see it. I started. We're fast tracking here, but but I started an Asian American advocacy group called APAC, Asian American Farmers Action Coalition,
Mm-hmm.
that would try to advocate for and fight for increased roles for Asians on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm so grateful to have like a group of Asian performers that I call my my friends and
Sure.
my cohorts in this fight. And I have to say it's really subtle, but it's sort of like the need to not make waves, or the need to stand up for ourselves, but in a way that is diplomatic and doesn't shut people down. And those are all the things that I love about the group as well. Like those are also positives, but I do sense sort of like there is a really subtle difference between sort of the immediate sort of like, what, that's not fair, let's change that,
Exactly.
that I might have, that privilege of like not being afraid to speak out and even like dress down someone for something that I think is despicable behavior, versus sort of the need to sort of, yes, recognize it, and yes, stand up for ourselves, but in a way that is still taking care of others. You know what I mean?
Do you think, and this is what's interesting, because the moment that you started speaking about that, I have an opinion, obviously, that so much of that comes from the way I was culturally raised. And even when I deal in Hawaii, and people have said this about the Japanese culture and just Asian cultures in general, that they're very respectful. They're much more soft-spoken. They are not as in your face about that's not okay. And that sort of, that it's not that they're not passionate about it. It's the style in which they go about trying to convey their thoughts, so to speak.
You're absolutely right. It's deeply, deeply cultural. And in fact, that's one of the things I love about having a meeting with my Asian cohort, is that no one freaking interrupts each other.
Yes.
It's amazing. Like, people don't, there's less ego involved. Like, people only add to the conversation, and you can tell that they've been listening. Like, there isn't sort of the jockeying for power, or sort of like needing to be right. Sort of like everything, it's so refreshing.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, those are deep cultural roots right there.
So let's talk a little bit about, for how long has your organization been around?
11 years.
This coalition. So the coalition has been around for 11 years, and the goal was to actually put it together of a number of your constituents and colleagues, so that you could try to increase the visibility and the availability of roles for Asians in general.
That's exactly right.
What was interesting is Pun had actually sent me the actual website, and I was looking at some reports from 2019, etc. And some of the interesting things that I found through it, and Pun, I've never actually told our listeners this. I used to be a theater actor for about 12 years. And I've been blessed and so fortunate to travel the world and do things like Miss Saigon and The King and I, and a ton of West Side Stories. And if there was some sort of ethnicity in it, I was in it. However, when people have asked, well, why'd you get out of it? I was like, because I got so tired of someone dying. I was like so tired of emoting and doing something so heavy. Kim dying, Lunta dying. Like, I just got tired of, in West Side Story, Tony, that, like, I just got tired of there always being so much tragedy. So like the last show that I ever did was Seussical, because it was light and funny, and it was about a dust speck. But I mean, with that being said, is in theater, and you and I have talked about this, I've been, very often, I remember when I used to audition a ton, you used to go in and you were just typed out. They would throw a lineup. It didn't matter how much, what your resume looked like. You walked in there, you were too short, too tall, too Asian, and you had no idea why you were typed out. You just weren't whatever the vision was. And I remember being typed out so many times, or being the single Asian person in, or ethnicity in a cast. In Seussical, incidentally, like I was the only, Asian individual. So it's interesting. If your organization had been around before I actually retired from theater and whatnot, what that would have been like, because I saw some of the studies and I was just, you and I have discussed how much of the representation comes from what is actually going on Broadway at the time, let's say, if we're talking about live stages, and what that representation looks like.
Yeah, it's crazy to me that in a musical about Dr. Seuss, whose characters are like green and black and white, like,
yep.
And red, that you were the only Asian in the cast,
Yep.
You would think there'd be a lot more inclusive casting happening for something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But then even then, like, you talk about Miss Saigon. Lea Salonga famously talks about, even after she won her Tony Award for Miss Saigon, she wasn't allowed to even audition for the role of Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady.
Wow.
And so, like, just those are the boundaries that exist, and they're both conscious and unconscious. It's like,
mm-hmm.
consciously, yes, there's this whole dramaturgical vocabulary and paradigm, by which we can actively choose to exclude people of color, right? So you can say, well, My Fair Lady takes place in whatever it is, 19th century London. What are the odds that there were actually, people of color that existed then? But then actually, and so there's all these, these facts, quote unquote. But then you do a little more research and you're like, well, actually, there were a lot of Indian immigrants at the time, and that lived.
Exactly. There's a huge community there.
Right, exactly. And Asians, and it makes sense that someone who was a person of color or an immigrant would want to take lessons to speak, more eloquently with better elocution, and so, like, that totally makes sense, so
mm-hmm.
why can't it be about, like, the best person, the best actor for the role,
mm-hmm.
or the most talented person getting the job? There are all these artificial boundaries that we put onto it. The same thing goes with, like, once you do research on, there were all white productions of Oklahoma, the musical, until people realized that, actually back in the day,
mm-hmm.
there were a lot of Native Americans on those territories, and there were a lot of, Black people, and there were a lot, there was tons of diversity. And so the only reason why we haven't historically seen it reflected on our stages, the only reason I can think of is white supremacy.
mm-hmm.
It's been an active exclusion of stories that do not matter. Like, suddenly casting a person of color changes the story being told, and I say that with air quotes. So and it's ridiculous to me too that you can, these people, like, cling onto these, these, what you might call historical realism, right? And, and as facts, quote unquote. But why is race so primary as to be the only thing that you're factoring out? It's not like we're doing revivals where everything is lit by candlelight, like it might have been.
Yes, exactly.
In actual, like, My Fair Lady times, and so we've already seen a million productions of My Fair Lady. Why can't we entertain the thought that Eliza might not be white? You know what I mean? It's so not important to the story being told.
Pun, and it's interesting because I also wonder how much of we as Asian, I'm an Asian American, and as an Asian descendant, how much of that is also things that we have has been also ingrained in us. I think one of the reasons why I bring that up is because while you were talking about why can't Eliza Doolittle be Asian, interestingly enough, is when I was doing Miss Saigon, a colleague of both of us, we worked with this wonderful singer and actress named Ann Sanders. And one of the things about Ann was she was the first Asian Ellen to ever be in a Miss Saigon. The Ellen, for whatever reason, before I had gotten to the company, had left, and she was one of the covers, and she was by far phenomenal. And I remember distinctly when I first went to watch the show and she was in it, seeing her, and I was like, I had already seen the show on Broadway, and this is the first time that I see her come out as Ellen, and I was like, oh, Chris has an Asian fetish. And I remember distinctly sitting there going, does he? You know, and I wonder too, when another former colleague in Jekyll and Hyde played not Lucy, but the other lead lady. And she was a Filipino background and just the most beautiful voice. And I remember people were commenting more on the fact that she was this Asian girl who was wearing a blonde wig. And I wonder at times how often as well we, or at least me, you know, as I have my own preconceived notions as well, you know, with the things that we were brought up with and how that affects the way we present ourselves and the way that we also approach trying to get more inclusivity on stage, or even in performing.
Doubt. I mean, I think that ties back into what we were saying about being a minority versus majority. Like, that is really minority thinking, you know, that is what traps you. And we're all guilty of it because we live in a society that values, you know, white stories more than any other stories. And so we never see ourselves reflected on TV, film, or stage. And so, you know, when I even when I catch myself talking about like what a versatile actor I am, you know, I'll talk to, like, you know, kids or drama students and stuff, and I'll be like, yeah, there's no reason why I can't play both the Dalai Lama and Pol Pot, you know. And then I'll catch myself and I'm like, wait a minute, yeah, those are opposite extremes, but they're both Asian men, you know, like they're both actually the types of roles that I would be called in for. That's just what we're used to. You know, it's not really imaginative thinking, you know, as opposed to, you know, instead of Pol Pot, maybe I should say Hitler or something like that, you know. But you know, then of course that runs into sort of like the historical figures and the facts of history and stuff like that. And it depends on the production, but I feel like especially for theater, you know, so much of the march of theater has been to become increasingly naturalistic. And I think that especially coming out of this pandemic where, you know, all we were consuming was just digital entertainment for the past 2 years, and there's a real thirst for live theater and that connection between, you know, that energy. I really do think that theater is going to return and revert back to doing what it does best, you know, not to try to copy TV and film, but actually, you know, do what is actually intrinsic to this medium, you know, and that the use of imagination and the use of being able to bend time and space on stage is something that I think you would think that theater would be worlds away in terms of, you know, inclusive casting or these types of occurrences of casting that we're talking about. But it's actually not the case. You know, if anything, in my experience as an actor, actually, TV has been much more meticulous about being color conscious when they're casting and being inclusive. And a part of that, I think, is because TV companies are owned by corporations who have their, diversity initiatives, and
Sure.
there's a lot of like legality and stuff within HR, and that is something that they have had to incorporate into their culture, and that is something that they value as their, core tenet. And meanwhile, theater, either you're dealing with not-for-profits who, the artistic director of the Roundabout Theater and Manhattan Theater Club have been there for 30, sometimes 40 years, and so there's no incentive to change there. They're going to do, what they've been, that's sort of what got them there in the first place. They're going to cater to their subscription base and continue doing what they're good at, and then you also have the Broadway commercial theater where there's less risk, because
True.
Producers aren't willing to take a risk on it unless it's something that has already been tested or tried and true. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't see it as often. But I think, ever since Hamilton changed everything. We've noticed from our stats. Oh, I guess I should tell your readers that one of the things that APAC is known for, that this group that I'm talking about is known for, is that we actually, there weren't publicly available statistics in terms of representation on New York City stages. And so we actually took it upon ourselves to count and put people into, different racial categories. And so we have the latest statistics on not only, actors of color on New York City stages, but also how many directors were hired and how many writers were employed and how many Broadway producers were white and how many, so now it's expanded. Now we're counting designers as well. And it's become really an important resource for the theater industry. And we were talking about this at a time when, diversity was not in vogue. But so just to backtrack, so we've noticed from our statistics that after Hamilton, so inclusive casting stayed fairly stagnant for the past 10 years until the 2015-16 season. I believe that was Hamilton's season. And then, suddenly, Hamilton became the cultural topic of conversation. And you could see that, the forefathers of this country being represented by people of color,
and all kinds of ethnicities,
and still demand top ticket prices. Like, that's when other Broadway producers went in whole hog, and you suddenly saw more diverse productions, like Natasha Pierre and Hadestown, which were both directed by the same director, Rachel Shavkin, but things like that, where you started seeing leads of color, and you didn't really see that as often before.
That's very true.
It definitely, I mean, just using, I guess, statistical terms, like it actually, inclusive casting actually increased by like 14% ever since Hamilton. So,
which is massive. I mean, that's double-digit growth, which is huge.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that type of visibility, when you get to see that for the next generation, becomes such an inspiring thing to see. Like, Mom, their face is like mine. Through the movement. One of the
most endearing videos I ever saw on YouTube was this Asian little girl who must have been 2 years old, and she was watching when Disney released Hamilton, their on Disney Plus. She pointed to Philippa Sue on the Hamilton stage, and she was like, "That's me," And even at two years old, it's like you see the world and what is possible, and when you grow up in a society and you've never seen yourself as, the princess or the king or, the lead, um, then that's when you start thinking of yourself as not as important.
Speaking about that and seeing visibility, back in 1997, Cinderella was put out, and Whitney Houston, was the fairy godmother, and they had this entirely all-encompassing type of inclusion where Whoopi Goldberg played the prince's mother, and Brandy was Cinderella, and it was so interesting because I remember back then thinking, this is so cool. The prince was Filipino, his parents were black and white, his fairy godmother was Whitney Houston, and Cinderella was Brandy, and
Paolo Montalban was the prince.
Yeah, Pablo Montalban. And you start looking at Bernadette Peters was the evil stepmother, and it just all sort of worked, and I just thought, this is so cool. And then there was a part of me, as I was reading your reports and everything, I thought, why? How is it that we're still here? And
yeah, that production of Cinderella was what, 98? Was it
97?
97. So that was like 25 years ago, dude.
Yeah. So it's interesting because when I think about the visibility, and as you said, this 2-year-old girl going, "That's me." It's a continuous battle. It's a continuous need to show up, and it's a continuous need to be represented. And also, I think one of the interesting things is to be very careful about how we represent, right? Because, and I'm guilty of this wholeheartedly. When I knew that I was the only Asian or ethnic person on the stage, I played up to it big time in every stereotypical way. And I was reading an article about another Hawaii actress named Kelly who said, is she'd taken many roles and she was sorry if it had done damage to the representation of an Asian female, so to speak. And yet
their last name was Hu. That's an Asian last name.
Exactly. But we also have, it's at some point you have to show up on screen and sort of do the job that you're paid to do.
Right. Wait, I'm sorry. So are you saying that when you were the only Asian in the cast, you tried to be more stereotypical because you thought that's what they expected of you?
I absolutely did it in different productions. Like there was definitely much more of an Asian kung fu sort of, Asian twist to things at different points. As Kelly said in her article, is normally the Asian female is either the bitch or the assassin. And that's what she played into, and
they're either the ingenue or they're the temptress, right?
Absolutely.
It's the dragon lady.
Exactly. And it's sort of funny, like even while I was doing different things, because I would play up to certain things so much. Like, do you remember that 90s when Margaret Cho was doing All American Girl?
Yeah, of course.
And she got so much flack from the Asian community about it, and like the way she was playing certain things. And you look at shows that are on TV now, Fresh Off the Boat and whatnot, it's, yes, they do play into certain stereotypical behaviors and certain things, but do you do that so that we can be represented, or do you just shy away from it because that's not truly always the way it is?
Yeah, like I was so excited for All American Girl. I was so sorry that became.
I know, me too.
They sort of shot themselves in the foot by, trying to appease everyone. But yeah, I mean, I was also during the same era. Like, I got so mad at Bobby Lee on Mad TV for all of it, but for leaning into those Asian stereotypes. Here he was like the first like Asian comedian on a national, public platform, and it all became about the chinky accent, and
exactly,
and the bad bald wigs, and I was so angry because the next morning at school, inevitably, all my
you made fun of.
Yeah, the white people would start going like ching 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 chong 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 chong, Actually, it still continues. In fact, I was in rural Connecticut at a restaurant with my husband last week, and there was this like 8-year-old kid on the next table, you know, who was like looking over me and like making like sort of like ching chong faces with his mouth, like silently, you know, and like eyes and stuff. And, you know, I really wanted to like go up and, you know, embarrass him in front of his parents. But I, you know, actually like I was actually on the phone at the time, and I just basically ignored it. But just to say that stuff is still happening today. And, you know, because we're late for your March episode, which tied into Asian American Awareness Month, as you were saying at the top, I just want to point out that there is such a direct line between those stereotypes that you see on TV and how Asians are treated in real life. And that, you know, corresponds to what you were saying about the roles that Asian women are allowed to play as well. They're either, you know, the helpless prostitute, Kim from Miss Saigon, right? Or the bitch, the dragon lady, you know, and it's these two extremes, and there's no, it's no wonder that there are actually people like that murderer in Atlanta who is targeting Asian massage parlors, you know, and gunned, you know, these 6 Asian women down because they were considered, according to him, in his mind, quote, temptresses.
Exactly.
You know, and yet then also the sheriff of the local county there, who made the press statement and stuff, could also say with no irony whatsoever that there wasn't proof yet that this was a racially motivated crime. You know, so people don't make the connection, like, unless you have a gunman who's yelling, you know, gook, as he's slaying people, it's not you can't prove that it's a racially motivated crime, you know, like. But here was someone who targeted these women because he saw them as temptresses, and you know, because they were Asian women, and so those stereotypes are damaging. They're you know, it's you know, we talk about our careers and opportunities and how they're limited, but this is no longer about our livelihood. It also becomes about our lives. You know, so the stakes are much higher, and we really do need to stop those stereotypes. To answer, but to respond to your question, I mean, I totally understand the need, the pressure to sort of fulfill those stereotypes and being hired specifically for that. When I first graduated from the Yale School of Drama about 20 years ago, you know, I had a similar experience to you, where I guess I didn't really feel like a minority until I entered the industry. And you know, at Yale, I was given opportunities to stretch myself, and it was all colorblind casting. But then you graduate, and I'm so thankful that my speech teacher hammered into me that I needed to learn an Asian accent and do it well. Because I would say when I first graduated about 20 years ago, about 40% of all of my auditions required an Asian accent. I was always, almost half. I was always playing the foreigner, the immigrant, you know, the other, right? And even when you were playing doctors and lawyers, they were always the ones who were on the periphery, right? They were the information givers. They were the ones who came in, and they might progress the plot forward, but they're not where the heart of the story is going to be.
Or they're the scientists.
Right. No, exactly. Exactly. Those are the male stereotypes, right? The
exactly.
Geek, and so very asexualized, and anyways, so
where's the balance?
Where is the balance, right? I mean, I think that the balance comes when there are more roles out there, and you start seeing roles that represent the three-dimensionality of who we are as human beings, you know. And yes, there are Asians with accents, but that doesn't mean that the accent is funny, or that's why you laugh at them, you know, or, you know. So it's about seeing us as real human beings, and sort of, what it goes back to what you were saying, Ant, which is that, we can't always trade on our trauma, that in order for there to be a reason to have an Asian on stage, it's because, you're talking about race, or you're going to be, talking about, or they're going to be like brutalized, or,
Yeah.
we're part of the American landscape. So just factor that in,
I think that's and I know as I have a lot of work to do, even in the way that I view myself and contributions that I can make, in visibility, and how we actually help increase that visibility, but without necessarily the preconceived stereotypes that come with it.
Right. Like I've been in situations where I did a Chris Rock movie, 2 Days in New York, where I was auditioning for, I was playing a masseuse, a Chinese masseuse who had just come from China. And, and I was reading it, and the first thing that I think of when I get a role like that is, can I make it three-dimensional? Can I humanize this person?
Sure.
And there are actually, people from China who just got off the boat yesterday and work in massage parlors, and that's not what's most unique or exciting about them. This guy was really unique. Like, he was massaging Chris Rock and like making butt fucking jokes. Like he recognized Chris Rock as sort of the DJ at a local radio station. And Chris Rock was going to be his ticket to gain like his own fame in America as a comedian, And so like, it was a really great character.
Yeah.
But for all of that, like one scene.
Sure.
And it was one of those things when shooting that, like, everyone was like doubled over with laughter, trying not to like ruin the take. And but then I realized in retrospect that no matter how hard I tried to humanize him, what was funniest was his accent. It would not have carried the same way if he didn't speak in this, in this accent. And I guess butt fucking jokes are funnier with an Asian accent. I don't know, but like, it just taught me that like there are some roles that I can't ever change the DNA, the structure, the way that it's written, and thankfully it was actually cut out. I don't know if that's because people realized that it was off color, or it didn't progress the story. So
sure.
It was probably a good thing that I ended up on the cutting room floor, but it was an important lesson for me, that there are certain roles that I can change and others that I can't.
And I think we have Ashley Park, who's, playing in Emily in Paris. She's done tremendous things on Broadway. To not necessarily always play the temptress, she's played ditzy and high strung, and she actually is a very opinionated. I think Emily in Paris has also taken away those stereotypical where she's an Asian actress, obviously, who has this accent, but how did she get to Paris? So I think there are certain things that I see that type of, they're changing the trajectory of what an Asian, person represents on film or even on stage. That's a
really, really good point, especially since like most people think like that character that she plays on Emily in Paris is actually Chinese. Like her family is actually living in China, and yet she talks with a perfectly Americanized accent, and but at the same time, like, we have to acknowledge that China is hugely cosmopolitan, and so many especially like well-off Chinese kids are educated overseas or have lived in America for a while. Like, they don't necessarily have accents like we think, and so we need to get over sort of our own preconceived assumptions that we make, in terms of what people look like and where they live. I mean, there's huge diversity in throughout, individual countries of Africa or the Middle East or in
Mm-hmm.
Asia. Someone that looks like me could be living in India and be Indian,
Mm-hmm.
and so like we also need to expand sort of what is possible in terms of casting as well, because
Mm-hmm.
um, we are very myopic, and we repeat the same habitual cues and coding all the time, um, and that can be really, really dangerous and harmful.
Look, I think you are spot on. It is definitely a journey for myself, as as well as anyone who is also in potentially in performing and whatnot. I think there's a huge opportunity to raise the bar. I think of the way that we present. I also think that there are roles, as to your point, where we don't necessarily have the ability to really bring this three-dimensional sort of tapestry to the role itself, and it is what it is, whether it be heavily accented gestures, etc. I know I've done it at different points in my life and in my career, and I think now more than ever is it's I love this interview more than anything else in this episode, because of the fact that it's making me rethink even some of the things that what my preconceived notions are, and how I show up. So any last things that you want to leave us with, Mr. Pun?
Oh my gosh, was that it? My gosh, I have
I know
so much
that was
to say.
I know, and there's like literally we've been yakking through this whole thing, and it's been interesting to this is different from so many of our other episodes, because of the fact that very often as I'm talking to someone about the journey that they've been on, whether it be Cassidy when she was an Olympian and she still is, and Jeremiah from our last episode where he was born with this devastating disease, in the respect that I'm right there relating to so much of what you're saying, and also having come from being a theater actor and then trying to sort of realize what my own understanding and what my own beliefs are, has really been kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of journeys, I mean, I guess the actor's journey is a lesson in itself in terms of persistence and fortitude,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like an optimism that things will work out.
Yes.
And I think part of that is, I think actors might get a bad rap for being narcissistic, but so often we have to tell ourselves, we have to have faith in ourselves, that even if other people don't see it, we know we're good, and I always approach every role as an opportunity when I audition, as a chance to show them how it should be played.
Mm-hmm.
I have no control over whether the producers think that this should go to a white person or, someone taller or whatever, or older or younger.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what's so great about, that you can have 100 actors, each saying a Hamlet monologue, and each, or I guess a soliloquy. And each and every single actor is going to bring something different, and that's
Absolutely.
that's what makes that actor intrinsically that person. And and so much of my journey has been about, in addition to fortitude, it's been about verisimilitude in a way. It's about not listening to all those outside voices that we internalize, and
Mm-hmm.
I've even stopped using the term minority now. I actually prefer underrepresented people or marginalized people, because the word minority itself has minor in it, which the root is
And
lesser than.
it also brings up a preconceived notion the moment you hear it.
That's right. And in fact, we need to invert that, because we're actually the global majority now.
Yeah, exactly.
And will be in America in the future, upcoming in the next 10 years. And so we need to reclaim our power in that regard, and really think of ourselves as majority people. And so that journey of being truthful to myself has really been my journey as an actor, to really sort of find my voice. I felt like growing up, I was so good at putting masks on for other people. And that's one of the reasons why I am such a transformative artist. But once you do the work of finding who you are underneath all of that, then you can truly be authentic, no matter what kind of role you're playing, And so that's the best thing for me in terms of the journey of being an artist, is that you are in many ways a nomad. You are in many ways countercultural, because you're living a life where you are truly following your bliss in a world where people, I think, do not, or at least find ways to, it's tough to I'm really privileged to be able to do what I love, and especially during the pandemic, I've realized that it's something that I can't do on my own, and to have been largely unemployed for so long has been really daunting, in terms of, yes, I've had to pivot. I've done much more like voiceovers and stuff that I didn't focus on before. Those were some of the few areas that the industry was still thriving in during the pandemic. But I've also thought about sort of, what is important to me as an artist, and to continue to become a better artist, and to work with people that inspire me, and we don't always have the opportunity to pick and choose. And I don't want to set it up as sort of this, you and I both know friends or people who have chosen stability over, following your bliss, so to speak. And it's so easy to say, hey, you just follow your bliss, and that's sort of like your mantra at 20 years old, but then you realize how difficult it is to do that. And I think most people become unhappy when they see things as sort of this black and white thing. It's like, oh, if I can't be an actor, then I'm not good enough. I failed in my dreams or whatever. But it actually, whatever you transition to or pivot to, like, you're still using all those things that you learned as an actor, whether that's people skills, or whether that's, analytical skills, whether that's dramaturgical skills, or public speaking skills, or even, the entrepreneurism that underpins the life of an actor. You constantly have to redefine yourself.
And you're constantly hustling.
And you're living life as if there is no safety net, and a lot of people don't have that ability. Like that, that is something that is really rare. I mean, and that's one of the things that I feel like, when you're chosen, you do have this gift. And I don't judge actors who have quit acting or who have transitioned into something else, because it's not about thinking of it as no longer following your bliss, but realizing that your bliss is actually much wider than you realized, and that you can be happy and fulfilled doing other things that might fulfill the same needs that you had as an actor, but just not in that same capacity.
Yeah, and the method in which you fulfill that bliss can be different.
Exactly.
And with that, Pun, I want to just thank you so much for your time. We are at the end of episode 15 of the Journey NYC podcast. I've just been speaking to Bandhu, who I personally think is a very successful Asian actor. And we've been discussing a lot about Asian representation. We're a couple months late, but it's been tremendous just hearing all of the stories that you've shared and where you come from. And
the last thing I want to say, Ant, thing I want to say is for all those people listening who are like, yeah, I wish we could just live in a world where, color doesn't matter and like it should just be about talent. To all of those people, please, go out and actually support work that's being created by artists of color, and recognize that really do open your eyes in terms of like the TV programs you're watching and how diverse they are, and really speak out against the lack of diversity that you see, and support the projects that actually allows that to be a possibility in the world, full diversity.
Absolutely. Pun, thank you so very much again just for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for being a part of the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ant.
Okie dokie.
Ciao.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. Until next time, take care.